as well as aviation really caused the gasoline engine to dominate over the electric vehicles. But up until May of 1974, Saskatoon had electric trolley cars running. And so that, ironically, is a year before the comparison of the Pinto and the Oldsmobile. So it seems like in a lot of ways there was a backwards reaction to the energy crisis in the 1970s, and we became more reliant in a lot of ways on fossil fuels. Wired electric vehicles continue to serve in almost all major cities in North America, the larger cities with some form of subway or trolleys transit. And diesel-electric hybrid trains continue to be the dominant form of rail transport across the globe. But other than those historical vehicles, over the last number of decades, there have been a small number of hobbyists who have converted traditionally gasoline vehicles to be electric, or they found there have continued to be manufacturers, typically in other parts of the world, and people have imported maybe one or two of those vehicles into the province, mostly as a hobby. Warehouse and mining, because of the low pollution and availability of combustion gases, have used electric vehicles in production throughout the last few decades. And then in 1996, as a result of the California legislation, General Motors and a number of other companies rebuilt or restarted the electric vehicle production with the famous Saturn EV1 from Saturn Motor Company division of General Motors. But I couldn't find any record in Saskatchewan. I don't know, have you guys ever seen one here? Mm-hmm. Then, as a result of the same initiative to get reduced tailpipe emissions, both Honda and then later Toyota made hybrid vehicles which still use gasoline, but they have an electric drivetrain in the vehicles. So it's a natural transition to pure electric from those vehicles. And so in a lot of ways, the Toyota Prius has become the icon of electric. Even though Toyota hasn't formally released into production, a plug-in Prius has become very common in a number of circles, and sort of a target of what can be achieved. So I'm going to talk now about electric and hybrid vehicles and what they are. So a pure electric vehicle will be powered by electricity that's typically produced by a utility or by solar PV in a grid-tied configuration. There's no tailpipe emissions from the vehicle, but depending where your electricity comes from, you'll still have the pollution problems that I covered earlier. The maximum range is limited. It used to be severely limited, and this is something that car makers are working on now, but 100-kilometer range in good weather is probably a reasonable target these days. And in terms of mileage, you can go about 4 to 8 kilometers per kilowatt. So this battery is a 2-kilowatt battery, so this battery will maybe take you 15 kilometers. The pair of them will let you go 30, and then if you had a car built around a set of batteries like that, you can scale up, but that's where the 100-kilometer range comes from, because once you have 10 of those batteries, I think that battery is about 50 pounds, so all of a sudden you're adding 500 pounds, and all of a sudden the weight becomes dominant over the electrical capacity. Passenger heating and cold weather performance is a concern among many people I talk to in a climate such as ours, as well as performance in the snow. So a hybrid, a non-plug-in hybrid, derives all its energy from the fossil fuel still. Most of the examples we see now are gasoline as a fossil fuel. They have a similar range to a conventional car, but they use a battery for temporary energy storage, and this lets them gain energy from regenerative braking. It also allows them to use an electric motor which has a lot of torque for startup and acceleration, meaning the internal combustion engine doesn't need to be a high torque engine, and that's how they can get away with using the more efficient Atkinson cycle engine. Another benefit of that is when they're using the gasoline engine, they can run it at its maximum efficiency, and if the power being produced isn't needed for propelling the vehicle, it can also be stored in the battery. Once the battery gets a significant amount of energy into it, the conventional engine can shut off and the vehicle can travel for some distance on the batteries themselves. So in terms of mileage, if you will, or the economics, I have a slide where I'm trying to compare gasoline, both emissions and consumption, with electric vehicles. Now I've just taken some sort of sample numbers for an electric vehicle. Obviously the size of the electric vehicle, and there are a number of outliers, but these values that I've used are probably typical for the sort of this upcoming generation of electric vehicles like the Nissan Leaf and the Mitsubishi i. So if you assume 4 kilometers per kilowatt hour, it works out to 25 kilowatts a 100 kilometers. And you can see the dollar per 100 kilometer value works out to just under $3 for the electric vehicle. And then I've compared it to 2 different gasoline vehicles. One of them is, I guess, North America's most fuel-efficient production vehicle, and then just a Cadillac Escalade, the typical big SUV. So you can see the electric vehicle at current pricing costs about half to operate as a Prius hybrid, and almost a tenth of the big SUV. And then in terms of emissions per ton, it's about 5 times as good, or 4 to 5 times. And then just sort of, a lot of people will ask me about taxes. One concern is when you start using, if you're using a gasoline vehicle, you're paying road taxes and taxes when you buy your gasoline. When you use electricity to charge your vehicle, you may not be paying any taxes if you're charging it with photovoltaics, or you'll just be paying GST and maybe municipal fees if you're charging it with utility electricity. So I've shown that the electricity price includes 14% taxes, and the gasoline cost includes 30% taxes, which are at the pump. And then I also suggested that if you're driving 100 kilometers a year in your car, you would need about a 2 kilowatt grid-tied array, which is just under half the size of the solar electric array on the Verico Home here. So with half the size of the Verico Home solar electric array, you could drive for the rest of your life for free if you limited yourself to 10,000 kilometers a year. Does that make sense? You get what I'm saying there? So other operating costs. In general, a pure electric vehicle has many fewer moving parts than a gasoline engine. There's typically no transmission, and the motor itself only has 1 or 2 moving parts as opposed to hundreds of moving parts in an internal combustion engine. Also, the temperatures of those moving parts are considerably cooler because you don't have combustion or combustion byproducts. There's also less fluids, no transmission fluid, no lubricating oils typically, gasoline, radiator. And then the use of regenerative braking greatly extends the brake pad life on your vehicle. So it's using electromagnetic force to slow down the vehicle instead of friction. So there's less wear. On sort of the negative side, a lot of people ask about batteries. It was a huge unknown when the vehicles first came out, but the first generation Prius is now 14 years old, and they haven't had a lot of problems with the batteries. In general, the batteries have been lasting this full amount of time. There were concerns on replacement costs, but up until now, because the batteries have been living for the full life of the vehicle, there hasn't been a huge demand in aftermarket batteries to drive up the price. One issue now, though, is the previous generation of batteries were nickel metal hydride, whereas the new electric vehicles are using a new type of battery. So again, battery technology will have to be proven if the new lithium-ion batteries, if these batteries can last the 15-year lifespan of a vehicle or not. So where are we today? And by today, I'm actually meaning about 2009, before any of the current production electric vehicles were released. So there were no production vehicles in North America that were pure electric or that you could plug in to generate electricity. However, what there is, in Saskatchewan, SGI has an incentive for hybrids and very fuel-efficient vehicles. And you can see I have a couple of numbers from 2009 and 2010. And you can see just in those years alone, the number of those extremely efficient vehicles increased 44%. And what that suggests to me is that residents in Saskatchewan are interested in these new vehicles. It's not just for California or Toronto, places without snow. The residents of our province are purchasing these vehicles in significant quantities. So I infer from that that as new Nissan Leafs and Chevy Volts come out, they'll be purchased in Saskatchewan the same way that the Priuses are. There are some commercially available conversion kits to convert small vehicles to be pure electric vehicles, and there's also kits available to convert existing hybrid vehicles to be plug-in hybrid vehicles. The types of kits that are the types of vehicles that are typically converted are small Japanese delivery trucks. The Chevy S10 is extremely popular conversion, and almost any subcompact car. Production hybrids today are very widespread. In most cases, they're the most fuel